Welcome everybody to week 6 of Middle Eastern Government and Politics. This is going to be our last module where we are building our substantive foundation about the region before we move into talking about our three main case studies, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab Spring, and Syria, although we also are going to be talking about Iran in this particular module given recent events that have unfolded in the region. So to begin with, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview about the way that political scientists think about states and how they interact with each other. Because the focus of this week's chapter and the reading was about the international relations of the Middle East, and international relations is a subfield of political science, as you probably know, that focuses on relations between countries in the international system. So if you are studying IR, or if you took like POL 140, for example, at UWL, you would have learned about realism, liberalism, constructivism. You would have learned about the United Nations and maybe peacekeeping and why wars happen. And you would have learned about the World Trade Organization and international organizations and international law and international development, all of these things, right? But to kind of ground our understanding of this particular chapter that we're reading and also what's happening in the region, I want to give you a little bit of an overview about the theories of IR. So this particular figure is from a textbook that I used to use when I taught IR at a previous university to UWL. And the way that we can think about the theories of IR is, do they focus on the individual as the main actor and the main driver of what happens internationally? Do they focus on the domestic level? So this is basically like the characteristics of countries. Are you a democracy or not? Or do they focus on the systemic level? So what the systemic level is just really essentially what is the distribution of power in the international system? Do you have like two countries who are basically equally powerful and everybody else just kind of falls in those two camps of countries? So think about like Cold War, when you had a bipolar system with the US and the Soviet Union. Do you have like a multipolar system? Think like Europe pre-World War II, where you have like 5 main powers and they're all equally important and they're kind of vying and jockeying with each other. Or do you have a unipolar system where there's like one main hegemonic power that is like the most military, economically powerful across the world? So think like the United States after the end of the Cold War. And so these theories emphasize different aspects of the international system, and they will emphasize different explanations for whether states can and cannot cooperate, for the behavior of states. So I know that there's other ones listed here, obviously like gender theories, peace studies, Marxism, postmodernist theories, but the three kind of main overarching grand theories of IR are constructivism, liberalism, and realism, and its more recent offshoot, neoliberalism. And so these are the ones that I am going to focus on. So there is, and I'm not going to play this for you now because you can listen to this and watch it on your own, but this is a 4-minute video from a political scientist. And this one focuses on what is realism. So it gives you kind of a 4-minute overview of the main characteristics of realism that I would like for you to watch. You don't have to watch this like right now, but you can watch this, pause this recording and watch it, because I think it gives you a nice overview of what realism is. And so let's assume that you paused and watched that, right? Realism is a theory that assumes that in the international system, right, and it emphasizes the international system, it kind of thinks of as countries like balls on a pool table, where it doesn't matter what's within them, right? It doesn't matter who the leader is. It doesn't matter necessarily like what the domestic politics of those countries are. What matters is the distribution of power, because the international system is comprised of anarchy, And anarchy here doesn't mean like crazy chaos. It just means that there is no 911 for countries to call if something bad happens to them. Sometimes people think that the United Nations is the 911, but it's not. The United Nations is an important international organization. It was created after the end of World War II, basically to prevent a third world war from happening, which it has been successful in, right? To this point, we have not thankfully had a third world war. But the UN is only as powerful as its member states are, and the UN and the Security Council specifically, which has 15 members, 5 of whom are permanent, and these are the 5 victors post World War II. So Russia, China, the UK, France, and the US. Those 5 states have veto power, and they have veto power for a specific reason, so that was designed to prevent another world war from happening, in the sense that if you have one of the 5 major powers and they don't like something that other countries are doing, they can veto that in the Security Council. And while that seems frustrating, that is a way for them to ensure that their interests are being pursued, and that so they don't have to go to war to try to get what they want. So there is no 911 for states to call in the international system. And so because of that, realists say, well, it's kind of like a dog eat dog world. You can't cooperate with anybody. It's a zero-sum game, in the sense that, like, if one country seems to be winning from a cooperative relationship, that by default means the other one needs to be losing. It's a way of thinking about the world where countries have to be looking over their shoulder constantly to make sure, like, who's around them, who's going to try to overtake them, right? And so what realism focuses on is power, because if you have power, you can defend yourself, right? If you have power, probably other countries are going to be less likely to attack you. And so power is a real focus of realism. And what is power? One of the main ways that we measure it is military power, right? So here's just a couple of like screenshots of infographics or tables thinking about power in the sense of military power. Power in the sense of military capabilities as well. These are the top 40 countries when it comes to military spending, and the US by far outspends, not only in terms of absolute terms, but also just in general, like as a percentage of GDP compared to like other big group of 7 countries. So like the group of 7 countries that have like the most advanced economies also outspends. But power can also be defined as more than just military capabilities. But it's hard to measure this. There's been a big debate in political science, and lots of people have tried to figure out what a country's actual power is. So I just provided like 2 examples here. The Correlates of War Project has this composite indicator of national capability, or like SYNC index, where they're trying to measure power, not just in terms of like military expenditure or personnel, but energy consumption, iron and steel production, etc. So that's one way that folks who study realism and want to measure power would do so. The Pardee Institute at the University of Denver also has a global power index. So this is one that tries to not only look at military capabilities, but also look at things like, for example, like diplomatic power and reach, the economy, etc. So that is realism, right? Realism, if you're trying to explain what countries are doing from a realist perspective, you would be looking at the balance of power, you'd be looking at military capabilities as well as other dimensions of power, right? You would think that countries may form alliances, but they're just alliances out of convenience. There's nothing like inherently cooperative about them. And so it's a very much like dog eat dog type of world perspective. All right, so next is liberalism. Now, liberalism has different like varieties of it, and also I should say that realism also has many, many different flavors. There's like defensive realism, there's offensive realism, there's the security dilemma, which was mentioned in the textbook, which is really the idea that because there's anarchy, you can't trust your neighbor, and so you build up weapons, but your neighbor thinks it's that you're building up weapons to attack it, and so they build up weapons, and you just kind of this like escalation of weapons buildup, which is also why countries try to have like non-proliferation treaties and arms treaties to prevent that from happening. But liberalism is a much different way of looking at the world. So you can pause and you can watch this video about liberalism. And so, one of the reasons why liberalism emerged, and the reason why I'm talking about it as realism first, and then liberalism, and then constructivism, is because they emerged in different time periods. Realism is a theory that was really prominent during the Cold War, which makes sense because you did have a big rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. You did have a bipolar system. And so, countries and scholars were really trying to understand how that distribution of power affected the way that the US and the Soviet Union and the countries that like were their allies were interacting with each other. So, but what happened though after the Cold War ended is you had a different international order where you basically had the United States and you had a hegemon. And in the meantime, right, even when the Cold War was still ongoing, what you had is you had a lot of international governmental organizations start to emerge, and they really took off. Here's like the end of World War II. As the number of states increased, the number of international governmental organizations also increased, but at a much, much higher rate than states did. And realist theories could not answer this effectively, right? Because realist theories would say, well, these international organizations are just, states only use them because it's convenient, but why so many and why did they last? And so liberal theories emerged to try to explain this. Liberal theories also emerged to explain the fact that, after the end of World War II, there really has been very little wars, thankfully, between states. So this is from a data set from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Uppsala, Sweden. They collect information about state-based conflicts from the end of World War II to the present. So they update their data set annually. And they have these different measures of state-based conflict. So extra state, these are just basically like wars of like colonies for independence. Interstate, these are wars between countries. Intra-state, these are civil wars. And then internationalized, intrastate is internationalized civil war. So like Syria falls in here as an internationalized civil war. And so what liberal theories also emerged to explain was, okay, so yes, there's anarchy, but after the end of World War II, we really don't see very many wars between countries, which is a really, really good thing because countries are the ones that have militaries, and so those are the way more destructive conflicts than civil wars are, because by definition, civil wars are fought by a rebel group against a government, and that rebel group is never going to be as powerful as the government that it's fighting against. So this was also something that realist theories couldn't necessarily explain because, yes, it's not to say that realist theories assume that war is possible. It's just that's going to be maybe more likely, but it wasn't very likely, which again is a very good thing. And just some additional information, right? This is the number of armed conflicts in the world by year, and this is the total number, and these are the new ones. And, you can just see when it comes to interstate conflicts that they have increased over time, but what we are still thinking about here is the fact that most countries do not go to war with each other, right? So this is looking at interstate conflicts that have battle deaths of at least 25 per year, which would be considered a low-level conflict, right? Actual wars have battle deaths of 1,000 per year. So the recent attacks of the US and Israel on Iran unless we get to that battle death threshold of 1,000, that would just be like a militarized interstate dispute and not an actual war. And most states are also just generally not at war with each other, whether there's just like a negative peace and they're not fighting, or whether they're actually at peace with each other. So what liberal theories do is they focus on explaining the fact that most of the time states are cooperating with each other, and that you can have states cooperate. And just because you're cooperating does not mean that one person's going to be the winner and the loser in the relationship, that you can actually have cooperation where both parties benefit from it, which is a different perspective from realism, right? Because realism assumes that if you're winning, I'm losing, or if I'm winning, you're losing. Liberal theories would say, well, we can both win, and that's totally possible. And so what liberal theories really focus on saying, based on the writing of Immanuel Kant, that you can have peace between countries in an international system that's even filled with anarchy, because you have three things. You have international organizations that enable countries to come together on a regular basis and interact with each other, right? So you have like diplomacy, and you have the ability for countries to meet with each other and resolve their issues peacefully. You have economic interdependence, which liberal or realist theories would say is awful, but liberal theories say actually that's really good, right? When you have economic interdependence, it's not that you're like beholden to another country. It's that you're both benefiting from this relationship, and you don't want to go to war because you would miss out on all of the positive benefits of trade, because trade can lift up like both of your countries' economic development. And then finally, like domestically, and so this is where like liberalism, yes, focuses on the international system to some extent, at least like the neoliberal variety, which was specifically created to address neorealism. But liberal theories also say like, hey, if you have democracies, like democracies are going to be able to resolve their disputes with other democracies in a peaceful way, which is something called the democratic peace. And so that is going to lead to a more prosperous international system where countries do not feel like they have to go to war to make their interests met or to address their national interests. This is just to clarify. This is not to say that democracies don't fight other countries. So democracies definitely fight non-democracies, but the democratic peace says that if you have two countries that are democracies, for various reasons, they will be able to resolve their disputes peacefully, and they do not go to war. And that's actually true. So that is liberalism in a nutshell. All right, then we're going to move on to constructivism. So this is a theory that emerged in like the 1990s, late 1990s, and it has a different view of the world, and it emphasizes different things. So you can pause and watch this video about constructivism. So here's just a quick question, right? Imagine that you're an analyst with the National Security Agency, and you are supposed to figure out threats to the U.S. And you get the following information about two countries, right? Country A has 500 nuclear weapons, country B has 5. And so which country is more threatening? Well, right, it's obviously country A if you're just looking on pure military power alone. But constructivism says, well, you can't do that. That's not giving you like the full picture of what's happening. And so there would be a difference, right? Country A is the United Kingdom, which is an ally of the US, and country B is North Korea, right? And so which country is more of a threat? Well, it's obviously going to be North Korea, even though, like, let's say hypothetically, they only have 5 nuclear weapons, because North Korea is seen as an adversary and its identity is different than the United States. That's the country that would be the greatest threat. So constructivism emphasizes things like how the identity of states affects the international system and how they act on the international stage. So like, for example, Norway and Sweden and Canada, these are all countries that see themselves as part of their like national identity as being involved in like peacekeeping and peacekeepers. So like Canada has been involved in a lot of like UN peacekeeping operations. Norway has been involved in mediating a lot of civil wars and trying to resolve civil wars. So those are their identities. And so constructivism says, hey, right, we need to really stop and think about like the identities of states and how they see themselves and how that influences what they do on the international stage. And then constructivism also looks at how norms emerge. So like post World War II, although I think this is being challenged now, there was a norm against territorial conquest, right? Where you're not supposed to invade your neighbor because you want its territory. You know, for the most part, states abide by that, like Russia notwithstanding, because Russia obviously did invade Ukraine. Russia thinks that Ukraine is like part of Russia. But generally, there's this norm against territorial conquest where you're not supposed to invade your neighbor to grow your economy. And so those are the things that constructivist studies. And then finally, I've got just like these few tables here that show you like who are the main actors in each of these theories. Like really for realism, it's just states and it's just the international system. For liberalism and neoliberal institutionalism, it's states, but it's also non-state actors, and constructivism is broader, right? Realism has a pretty pessimistic, I guess we could say, view of the individual, whereas liberalism has a more positive one, and constructivism, has a different perspective. And then realism thinks that the state is just basically like a unitary actor, so just focused on national interests. It doesn't matter like if you're a democracy or a non-democracy, right? What matters is power in the international system. Liberalism has a different perspective, and constructivism specifically tries to understand where like the national interests and identities come from. These two just kind of basically take it for granted. And then finally, right, interdependence is a good thing. Conflict and cooperation are possible. Not really possible in realism. I mean, you can have like a balance of power system, but really it's still like a dog-eat-dog world. And then constructivism would say that the international system is really just like what states make of it. And then they have different views on change as well. So that's it for this short lecture about international relation theories.